The Murder Nobody Reported, a Miss Marple Mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins with a murder that somehow nobody reported. When Miss Marple discovers the truth, she realizes the silence of the village may be hiding something far more sinister. Before we uncover the murder nobody reported, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1. The Murder Nobody Reported. Rain had been falling over St. Mary Mead since before breakfast. Not hard rain, nothing dramatic, just a steady grey drizzle that made the churchyard stones shine and turned the village lanes into narrow ribbons of mud. Miss Marple sat beside the window of her sitting room with her knitting in her lap. She wasn't really knitting, she was watching the road. There was something about the morning that didn't quite belong. The milkman had arrived 10 minutes late. Mrs. Pritchard's curtains were still closed at 8:30, and most curious of all, nobody had mentioned the police car parked outside Willow House. Miss Marple knew Willow House well enough. Everyone did. It stood at the far end of Church Lane behind a high brick wall with a neglected garden and a black iron gate that complained when anyone opened it. The house belonged to Mr. Arthur Bellamy, 62, wealthy, widowed, a man who collected old clocks and disliked visitors. He wasn't especially loved, but neither was he disliked enough to become village gossip, which in St. Mary Mead was saying something. At 9 o'clock, Inspector Harris came to see her. He was damp from the rain and looked tired. He removed his hat and stood near the fireplace while Miss Marple poured tea. "There's been an accident at Willow House," he said. Miss Marple looked up. "An accident? That's what we're calling it for the moment." His tone suggested he didn't like the word. "Mr. Bellamy is dead." Miss Marple placed the teapot down very carefully. "Oh dear." She waited. Inspector Harris knew that look. It meant she expected the rest. "He was found in his study shortly after 7, head wound. One of those old brass clocks was lying beside him." "And who found him?" she asked. "His housekeeper, Mrs. Doyle." "Was the door locked?" "Yes, from the inside." Miss Marple's needles stopped moving. "And the window?" "Closed." Inspector Harris sighed. "There were no signs of forced entry, no weapon has been found. Mrs. Doyle says she heard nothing during the night." Miss Marple looked toward the rain-streaked window. "How very unfortunate." "It gets worse," Harris said. "There's no obvious reason for anyone to have killed him." "There usually isn't at first." He gave her a tired smile. "That's why I've come here." Miss Marple smiled back. "Then you must have tea before you tell me anything else." For the next few minutes, the only sound in the room was the small tick of the mantel clock. Miss Marple listened to it without appearing to do so. Arthur Bellamy had been murdered. She was almost certain of that. Yet there was something stranger than the locked room, something Inspector Harris hadn't mentioned. "Who has been informed?" she asked. Harris frowned. "The family, of course. His nephew has been contacted. A doctor is on his way to make the official examination." "No, I mean the village." "The village?" "Yes." The inspector looked puzzled. "Why would the village need to be informed?" Miss Marple gave him a gentle look. "Because Mr. Bellamy is dead." There was a pause. "Mrs. Doyle has asked that we keep things quiet until we're certain what happened," Harris said. "I thought that was sensible." Miss Marple returned to her knitting. "Perhaps." But she didn't sound convinced. At 9:30, Miss Marple went out beneath a large black umbrella. She told herself she was going to the post office. This was not entirely true. The post office happened to be in the opposite direction from Willow House. Still, nobody in St. Mary Mead would have called her journey suspicious. Miss Marple had been walking through the village for years. She stopped to speak to Mrs. Carter about her roses. She asked old Mr. Green whether his knee was troubling him. She bought 2 envelopes from the post office and spent several minutes discussing the weather. Nobody mentioned Arthur Bellamy. That was odd, very odd. At the bakery, Miss Marple found Mrs. Doyle standing beneath the shop awning. The housekeeper looked pale. Her coat was buttoned wrongly. One button had been fastened through the wrong hole. Miss Marple noticed it immediately. "Good morning, Mrs. Doyle." The woman turned quickly. "Oh, good morning, Miss Marple. I heard Mr. Bellamy wasn't well." Mrs. Doyle stared at her. For just a second, something passed across her face. Fear, perhaps, or recognition. "He isn't well," she said quietly. "He's dead." Miss Marple lowered her umbrella. "Yes," she said, "I know." Mrs. Doyle glanced up and down the street. The village seemed perfectly ordinary. A bicycle went past. Someone shut a shop door. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked twice and then stopped. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Doyle whispered, "please don't ask me anything." "Why not?" "Because I didn't see anything." "I see. And I didn't hear anything." "Of course. And nobody came to the house." Miss Marple's expression changed very slightly. 19 people were in the village last night. At least, that's what they said this morning. Nobody went near Willow House. How interesting. Mrs. Doyle swallowed. Mr. Bellamy wasn't popular, but someone hated him enough to kill him. Miss Marple looked toward Church Lane. "Then why," she asked softly, "has nobody reported the murder?" Mrs. Doyle said nothing. That was the answer. Miss Marple returned home just before noon. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained dark. She placed her umbrella beside the door and removed her coat. On the hall table lay a small envelope. There was no stamp, no name, only her address written in careful black ink. Miss Marple opened it with a silver paper knife. Inside was a single sheet of paper. 4 words had been written across it. "You know he was murdered." Miss Marple read the sentence twice. Then she turned the paper over. There was another message on the back. "Ask who reported it." She stood very still, because she already knew the answer. Nobody had. Chapter 2. The Name That Was Never Spoken. By 3 o'clock the rain had returned. Miss Marple sat beside the fire with the anonymous note hidden beneath her knitting basket. She hadn't shown it to Inspector Harris. Not yet. Some information was better kept quiet until one knew what it meant. At 4, Harris arrived at her door with a troubled expression. "The doctor has confirmed it," he said. "Bellamy was murdered. 1 heavy blow to the back of the head. That brass clock beside him was used to make it look like an accident." Miss Marple's needles stopped. "And the village," she asked, "still doesn't know." Harris sighed. "Edward Bellamy, his nephew, arrived from London this morning. He's asked us to keep things quiet." Miss Marple looked at him over her spectacles. "And how did Edward know his uncle was dead?" Harris went still. "He didn't," he said. "That's exactly what he claims." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Then ask him why he told a railway porter that his uncle had died before anyone had informed him." They went to Willow House before dusk. Edward was waiting in the study. He was young, well-dressed, and visibly nervous. Harris questioned him directly, but Edward insisted he'd been in London the previous night. Then Miss Marple asked about the letters Arthur Bellamy had received. Mrs. Doyle quietly admitted that one letter had arrived without a name. "Where is it?" Harris asked. Mrs. Doyle looked frightened. "It's gone." A sudden footstep sounded upstairs. Everyone froze. Another followed. Harris rushed toward the landing, but the corridor was empty. A window stood open at the far end. Miss Marple approached it slowly and noticed fresh mud on the sill. Caught on a rose thorn below was a small piece of dark brown wool. She looked down into the garden. There were footprints leading toward the old shed. The shed was locked, but Harris forced the door. Inside, everything appeared ordinary. Then Miss Marple noticed disturbed dust beneath an old wooden box. Harris lifted it. Carved underneath the lid were 3 initials, A, B, E. "Edward Bellamy," Harris said. "That settles it." "No," said Miss Marple quietly, "it doesn't. Whoever carved those initials wanted us to find them." Before Harris could answer, Mrs. Doyle appeared at the doorway. Her face was white. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "there's something I haven't told you." "What is it?" Mrs. Doyle looked toward the house. "Mr. Bellamy wasn't murdered last night." Harris stared at her. "What are you saying? He was killed 3 days ago." She handed Miss Marple a small notebook. On the final page, Arthur Bellamy had written 1 sentence. "If I die, don't report it." Miss Marple read it twice. Then she looked toward Willow House. 3 days, a missing letter, a nephew who knew too much, and a murder that nobody had reported. Someone hadn't merely wanted Arthur Bellamy dead. Someone wanted his death to remain a secret. Chapter 3. The Murder Nobody Reported. The following morning, St. Mary Mead awoke beneath a pale winter sky. The rain had stopped, but the village seemed strangely quiet. Miss Marple sat in the corner of the Bluebell Café with Inspector Harris, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. On the table between them lay Arthur Bellamy's notebook, the missing letter, and a small piece of brown wool recovered from the rosebush. "There are only 3 people who could have known about the murder," Harris said. "Edward Bellamy, Mrs. Doyle, and whoever wrote that note." Miss Marple shook her head. "You're forgetting someone." "Who?" "The person who reported the murder." Harris frowned. "Nobody reported it." "Exactly." She opened the notebook again. "Arthur Bellamy wrote that his death mustn't be reported. That means he expected someone to discover his body. But Mrs. Doyle says she found him 3 days ago. If that's true, why did she wait until yesterday to call the police?" Harris stared at her. Miss Marple continued quietly. "Because she didn't find him yesterday. She found him 3 days ago, just as she said. But someone else entered the house yesterday and moved the body. They wanted the police to believe the murder had happened recently." "Who?" "Edward Bellamy." Harris looked shocked. "But why?" "Because Edward wasn't trying to hide his uncle's death. He was trying to hide the reason for it." Miss Marple explained what she'd discovered. Arthur Bellamy had secretly investigated his nephew. Edward had been stealing money from the family estate. Arthur had discovered the theft and planned to expose him. But Edward hadn't killed him 3 days ago. Someone else had. "The brown wool," Miss Marple said, "belongs to Mr. Green." Harris blinked. "The gardener?" "Yes, I saw him yesterday wearing a brown suit beneath his gardening coat. He told me he'd been repairing the church fence 3 days ago. He wasn't. Mrs. Doyle saw him at Willow House that afternoon." When Harris brought Mr. Green to the station, the old gardener broke down within minutes. He admitted that he had struck Arthur Bellamy, but it wasn't planned. Arthur had confronted him about stealing from the house. Green had panicked. 1 blow, then silence. "But that still doesn't explain the missing letter," Harris said. Miss Marple smiled sadly. "It was never missing." She reached into her handbag and produced it. Mrs. Doyle had hidden it because the letter contained the truth.
Arthur Bellamy had written to his solicitor explaining that Green had been stealing small amounts from the house for years. He had planned to dismiss him quietly. Edward had nothing to do with the killing. Mrs. Doyle had found Arthur dead and panicked. She knew Green had done it. She also knew that exposing him would destroy the old man's family, so she kept silent. Edward, meanwhile, arrived after receiving Arthur's letter. He thought Arthur was still alive. When he discovered the body, he moved it and tried to make the death look recent, hoping nobody would investigate the missing money before he could recover his own stolen funds. It was a tangled little business. As they walked back through the village, Inspector Harris shook his head. "You know, Miss Marple, I think you've made my job considerably harder." She smiled. "Perhaps, but you've solved the murder." Harris glanced at her. "Thanks to you." Miss Marple looked towards Willow House. The curtains had been drawn. The garden was still. Everything appeared peaceful again. But she knew better. "Inspector," she said quietly, "murder is rarely about the thing people think it is." He waited. She adjusted her gloves. "Sometimes the real crime isn't killing someone." Harris looked puzzled. Miss Marple gave him a small, knowing smile. "Sometimes it's deciding that nobody should know they were killed." And with that, she walked home through the quiet village, while behind her the church bell began to strike 10. If you enjoyed this mystery, subscribe to Haunting Vales for more Miss Marple mysteries, hidden secrets, and deadly village puzzles. There are always more stories waiting behind closed doors, and sometimes the quietest house in the village has the darkest secret of all.